In this video, we're talking about coercive and controlling relationships, but focusing on why people might stay in those relationships. With me again, I've got Cecilia Goodwin, who is a specialist criminal lawyer. My name's James Maguire. I'm a specialist family lawyer. So the two areas often cross over from the family aspects. And of course, sometimes people getting in trouble with the police or needing to seek the police's protection. At Maguire Family Law, we really undertook a survey in the summer of a sample of 2,000 people, looking at various questions about coercive and controlling relationships, really that pattern of behaviours, which doesn't always have to be about violence, but it can be sort of the emotional harm that people suffer. And just looking at some of the statistics that came out of that, of those surveyed, 14% felt that they were in a coercive and controlling relationship. And the main reasons that seem to come through that, which we'll touch on potentially, is the financial factors, the fear of change, the fear of being alone, and the children. Of that, 23% also said that religion and 21% said culture were a factor that they needed to consider when staying in a relationship. And curiously or not, but religion and culture were higher for men than women, 38% and 41% respectively, but financial factors were higher for women of 50% compared to men at 34%. So, Cecilia, from your perspective, do you see anything in terms of our culture or society and coercive control that might impact on this?
Yeah, I think in relation to these are some really interesting stats, by the way. Really quite, it gives you a better understanding of what people are thinking, what people are going through, and certainly the reasons that, they're remaining in some of these relationships, which are, for all intents and purposes, can be described as quite toxic. In relation to culture and societal norms, I've always thought that actually it's quite a big factor. And as a criminal practitioner, obviously, I requested to represent clients from across the spectrum. But one of the things that I started thinking about was the cultural aspect of it, which is a little bit more nuanced. And that's probably because of my culture. Part of my culture is African, but obviously I live in England, so I'm also British. But it's also understanding and knowing that some cultures are, in a way, they have an ability to facilitate some behaviors that could be, deemed to be coercive and controlling. So, for example, things like people remaining in marriages when they are going through these difficult sort of times in terms of the actual relationships, a lot of the time it's because culturally there is stigma and shame when you leave a marriage. You're expected to
Stick it out.
stick it out and try and make it work. And especially when you have children, you don't want children growing up in situations where they don't have mum or dad at home or in the same household. So there's a lot of pressures that come in from other places that actually I think this legislation is going to start making people really think carefully about what positions they're allowing themselves to remain in, and when and whether they should leave. But also, it's also double-edged because you have people who are remaining in those situations when they are, for example, the complainants, the victims. But then in terms of the people that are deemed to be the abusers, for example, well, sometimes the things that they are doing culturally are accepted within whatever culture that may. Now, I could never say, I don't think anyone can say and should never say that domestic violence culturally should be allowed because it's wrong, quite simply. But when we're talking about legislation such as this, coercive control, where it's looking at behaviors of people. So in relation to abuse in terms of physical, well, that's all dealt with by other areas of law, other statutes, common assault, ABH sort of thing. But here we're talking about more nuanced behaviors where maybe some cultures, some religions, it's the norm, it's acceptable. But actually,
Yeah, and touching on that, I would certainly see really from a society perspective, but really focusing on the courts. I think that perhaps there's directly, indirectly, a belief that people won't be protected by the courts, and at least for the family court, in that there's a fear of going to court. The other party could weaponize the proceedings against them. The government over the decades has cut back legal aid, so there's not often equality of arms in terms of one party being able to afford legal advice, the other party not being able to. And really, from again, as a family law practitioner, sometimes the judges not having the appetite to deal with financial abuse or domestic abuse properly. We have a checklist of factors when looking at financial cases. How long have they been married? Are there any children? How old are the parties? Health, what do they financially need? Contributions, the standard of living. But right at the end of that, there is actually a part of the law that talks about conduct.
right?
But in England, it's just that they put a gloss on that, for the court to take into account conduct.
Yeah.
That can be people hiding money typically, but it could be abuse. There is that gloss that it's such a high standard,
Yeah.
and there's such a requirement to meet that standard, which doesn't apply to all of the other factors, which I find quite interesting.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a difficult one, and it's difficult to know what the solution will be. And I think it would probably need a change of law for it to actually be enshrined in the court rules that not only should the courts deal with matters justly, but they should be looking to protect people from domestic abuse.
Yeah, and I think in respects of the criminal side of things, there has been so much work, both by the government, people who are, the legislatures, as well as the prosecution service, as well as the police, where there's a lot of emphasis and training now in relation to identifying all forms of abuse. And that's how we've ended up with this legislation in terms of coercive control, because it's something that for a long time just didn't exist. No one even thought, why would this behavior, warrant me being arrested, for example? But it shows you just in terms of the differences in arenas. I mean, in the criminal courts, this is something that really is it's one of those topics that I think everyone is gearing up and putting everything they have into it. And it's interesting to hear that in the family, sphere, family law sphere, there's still a bit of work to be done, I guess, and more understanding maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, and we'll touch in other videos about awareness, and perhaps in a further video to actually drill down on the types of behaviours that come before your criminal court
Yeah.
and my family court.
Yeah.
But thank you very much, Cecilia.
No, thank you for having me.